middle school, and this is different for K through 5, and it will be different for upper high school, is that there is a demand for students to have more access to informational text, argumentative text, editorials, nonfiction. The idea is that to prepare them well for college, that they need to be reading a broader spectrum of reading of text that's not just literature. And so the idea is that it may be shorter texts or texts that they use to then integrate into their writing. Another piece of jargon you'll hear is the staircase of complexity. So in elementary school especially, you'll talk a lot about finding just right books with students and leveled literacy and the idea that students should read independently at their level. But Common Core is asking teachers to continue to push to give students access to not just grade level text, but text that might be 2 to 3 years above their reading level. And the idea is that you're never going to read grade level, be confident reading grade level text unless you have exposure to it. So increasing opportunities for students to actively struggle, to learn reading comprehension strategies and apply them. That requires a teacher who really has a sense of how to teach reading. And so reading becomes a real fundamental part of Common Core, and it was also in the past standards, but it's being articulated in this idea of we need to provide access to grade level text for all students, but we also need to provide the scaffolding to help them manage that so that they become independent, and when they encounter difficult text, they don't just give up and turn away, but they actually are willing to engage and try. And so the other big piece of jargon we talk about is close reading. And close reading I'm going to talk about more later on in the presentation, what that looks like. I do think that's a place where writers coaches can have a rich dialogue with students, especially if they're writing based on texts. So we'll come back to that. And text-based answers, once again, the idea that a lot of their writing should be writing that has personal ideas or convictions in it. Sorry if I'm hitting the microphone. But it also should be accessing other people's ideas through text. And that text should be a primary way that students learn, rather than having a teacher lecture in front of them and front load the content every time there's a difficult text. That text is a primary way children learn. It's this idea of building independence. You also will hear, we'll talk more about academic vocabulary. Jane asked me to speak to that. It's a big push in BUSD specifically. The big thinkers around this are Marzano and Kate Kinsella. They've done a lot of work around how do you teach explicitly vocabulary so that students are comfortable in academic discourse and they're comfortable in reading challenging texts that may be using academic English. So we'll come back to that. And basically there's also this new thing that every teacher is a literacy teacher. And that means that there are skills specific to literacy that are also discipline specific. So a history teacher needs to teach their students to read like a historian, that there are specific ways that people engage with text when they're a historian. They consider the viewpoint, they consider the time period, they consider whether there's a bias. Likewise, teachers who are science teachers are looking for precision of idea, the precision of the vocabulary, how to know whether a theory is being proven adequately with evidence. And so this idea that all teachers are literacy teachers, but that the skills for their discipline may be unique to that class, and they have to think explicitly about how to teach students that, is somewhat new to Common Core. And I think it's pretty exciting because I think it is very different to read a novel than to read a chemistry textbook, than to read primary source documents from the Civil War. And so that's the idea. And then you mentioned, Karen, the idea of integrating technology. And this is a piece that I'm curious to see what will happen with writers coaches over time, because for many of us, using technology in our classroom has been students go on the internet, they do some research, then they type on a computer and they're using technology. And that is what we call Web 1.0. That's sort of where my generation of teachers came in. And now the new wave of thinking is students need to be able to comment on each other's work online. They need to be able to create interactive media presentations online. They need to be able to engage in classroom wikis where information is shared. And so there's this whole new set of skills that teachers are starting to learn that are really, our students came up with it with Facebook and Instagram. I mean, they've been commenting on each other's stuff forever, and yet this is something we're trying to figure out, how do we meaningfully do that in a classroom as well? So anyway, those are sort of the basic pedagogical shifts. Any questions so far? Or thoughts? Yeah.
So, and you might address this further on in the fine, but
yeah.
So it's just kind of like getting kids to struggle, which is actually really good, but that's not how kids are being taught now. And now, they kind of just like, if it's wrong, it's bad. If I get it wrong, I'm horrible. So are they looking at this psychologically at all for how to get these kids to not feel bad about themselves while they're learning how to struggle?
Such a great question. So it's funny because I was just reading a really powerful book called Everyday Anti-Racism, which is a series of essays written that are very pragmatic around best practices and instruction for teaching in a culturally responsive way. And one of the things they say is that particularly with your struggling students, students of color, it's very important to teach high help classroom with a high perfectionist classroom. That means you have high expectations, but you also create many ways that students can seek assistance. And so we've been talking a lot about, every teacher's in a different journey in terms of how they're implementing Common Core. I can't speak about our entire cohort, but I think as we become more interested in closing the achievement gap, we start to realize if you're going to raise the bar, you better help everybody get there. And the way you do that is somewhat by creating a sense that we're all learners. And when I teach reading comprehension with my students, I do this thing where I say, good readers know when they don't get it. So how do we learn when we don't get it? How do we pay attention? The best students in the classroom are the ones who are saying, I found this part really confusing. And so teaching that, I think, is something that we're all trying to push towards, but I don't think we're all in any one place. I think talking about teachers monolithically is probably the same as talking about coaches monolithically. We're an independent-minded bunch, and people do things differently. But that's my own personal 2 cents about that. I think it's really important. Okay. So interestingly, in Common Core, the standards have been simplified somewhat. So there used to be standards for teaching a response to literature, standards for teaching a research report, standards for teaching informational text, standards for teaching a narrative, standards for teaching a memoir. Common Core simplified it into 3 areas of writing, and that is narrative text, which can be fiction or it can be memoir, but it's told in a story type way. And the informational and expository is sort of your research summary, your research report-ish sort of things. And then there's this idea of argument. And I think response to literature and persuasive writing in particular are the 2 big areas that are now being housed under this term of argument, which raises some interesting questions because I still think those genres are unique and have unique rhetorical devices and things like that. But in terms of Common Core's focus of citing evidence, making a coherent claim, both of them do that, and they both fall under this term argument. Okay?
Response to literature
and persuasive writing fall under the category of argument.
Thanks.
No problem. So what have we taught teachers this year at BUSD specifically in Berkeley Unified? We have done PD on text annotation, collaborative close reading, and Socratic seminar, because one of the big pushes in Common Core is an increase in academic conversation, but academic conversation that is based in text. So what that means is that your students read a piece of writing and then they notate it, they highlight it, they ask questions of that text, they learn how to academically comment on it, they bring that text to classroom discussions, to Socratic seminars, where it's a student-centered discussion, and that's how they participate. So on page 2 and 3, you're gonna see how I recommend teaching close collaborative reading. This is just sort of how I've done it in my classroom. I'm not gonna really get into that because it's more of a teacher-based thing, but I just wanted you to get a sense of because writers coaches also are going to engage with students, hopefully, with more text. And a lot of times you're going to find, I'm not sure that child really understood that text. And so the best way to see that is to go back and say, let's pull out the reading you did. Let's look at what you were annotating. What was the most challenging piece? What was the most complicated piece for you? I think you might have misunderstood this. And having that juicy dialogue between a mentor and a student, especially in middle school, is incredibly powerful. And so I think getting our heads around what close reading can look like and where that's an opportunity for dialogue with a coach is really exciting. Yeah?
Do you see the annotation as being, over time, they're reading this text on the computer and then they're making little notes on it?
You can do that.
I mean, but reality is it's it's easier to make them write on it.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in in handwriting. Some teachers use Post-it notes for a textbook, although I don't recommend doing close reads with textbooks, to be honest. I think close reading is something that you do selectively. You pick a juicy, interesting, provocative piece of writing that kids are going to that has interesting ideas in it. So sometimes a textbook has that, but more than often it does not. So I use the example of history. There was a pretty whitewashed version of the story of Pocahontas in the textbook. I mean, they were trying to be politically correct, but I looked up on the internet the oral history of Pocahontas from the Arawak Indian, not the Arawaks, I'm sorry, I can't remember the tribe that she's from, but they had done their own oral history. And so we printed it out, we made a bigger margin for the students to annotate, and that was far more interesting to them because they had to read the textbook and then compare it. So then they started to have discussions, emotional reactions, arguments with each other. And that's what you're trying to get at, is that sort of engagement, right? So yet when they're commenting on their text, we want them to start having some sentence frames. That supports English language learning. It supports creating the schema in their minds for writing thoughtfully. And so you'll see on page 3 this academic language for annotating text. And it's kind of prompting them to acknowledge when they're confused. It's prompting them to bring out their own reactions to the text. And that invites them to talk in academic conversations like Socratic seminar. Okay? Questions, thoughts, reactions? Okay.
Really exciting, actually.
Yeah, I actually find a lot to like in Common Core. Testing and Common Core are a bit of a different thing, right? We can talk about that later, off camera. But since I'm also working at the Berkeley Evaluation and Assessment Office. Yeah, did you have a question or a comment?
There's a podcast where every week a group, they do this close reading of Harry Potter. They're going through chapter by chapter of all 7 books for an hour.
Whoa.
It's a close reading, and my daughters listen to it, and it's modeling for them, talking about a text.
Is it interesting?
Yeah, it's great. And what they're coming up with is incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. Yeah.
It takes time, right? I mean, that's why when you told me all 7 books of Harry Potter, I was just like, that's a lot of podcasts. That's a long time, because often with close reading, we pick something that's 3 or 4 pages long max, something the students can digest in a sitting so that they can do multiple rereads. And that's the other thing, is teaching students, you do 1 read to get the gist. You do a 2nd read to then think about what you think about it. You do a 3rd read to really get ready to engage in a conversation. The multiple reads, I mean, this assumption that you should read something once and you're done is not going to work very well for them in high school and college. So we're really trying to move away from that. And then I just showed, this is an example from our writing assessment of a text they read cold, meaning there was no teacher intervention, and they had room for annotating the text on the sides. This is the debate around homework. That would be the sample. And there's a variety of types of evidence they could cite. There were quotes, there was expert testimony, there were statistics, lots to chew on in the article. And then they had to write an essay cold. So that's the other big change in Common Core, is that at least in Berkeley Unified, when we did writing assessments for the whole district, it often became, because it was treated as a summative assessment, teachers really wanted to teach the heck out of the test. And so we had lots of pre-writing activities. Students would pick quotes with a partner. They would brainstorm themes. This is lovely instructional activities. Unfortunately, for a writing assessment, it meant that we often got essays that all sounded the same. So what evolved over time was trying to sell teachers on, it's okay to let them go and let's see what they can do by themselves when they silently read the text and annotate it. It's still best practices to do all of those instructional activities with other readings, but not with a reading that we're actually trying to assess what the kids can do independently. Because this idea of student independence, that they should have these skills internalized, that's really what we're going after, is that they learn these reading comprehension attack strategies. So anyway, this is just a sort of sense of how our writing district assessments have changed. In reaction to Common Core, we have a text now they read to cite evidence. We're not scoring holistically. They're not just getting a 4, 3, 2, 1. We're giving them, how well do you support your claim? How well do you cite evidence? How well do you use academic language, conventions, so that they have a clearer sense of where their areas of growth are.